Okay, so welcome to George TV. George is going to talk with an accent. We do not know why, but he is very happy to do so. See. Yeah.
Finished? This isn't George TV.
This isn't George TV.
Although no doubt he will be snoring very shortly.
Yes, because we're going to talk about licensing. So the Canal and River Trust finally finished its...
I think it's finally finished. I think it was probably finished on schedule.
Well, it was finished on schedule and finally released the results of its national review of licensing.
We talked about this in two previous videos, and I'll link them below. Just talking about how we found what we thought of the process and the questions that were asked. So we thought we'd do a follow-up now the results have been released, talking about what we found interesting and touching a bit on the changes that are actually being made as a result of the review. What I found quite interesting was the number of people that responded and the demographic of the people that responded.
The review questionnaire had questions that were both kind of what they're calling quantitative, which were basically just, you get to choose on a scale of 0 to 5, how do you feel about this? So these were all being collated together and seen as kind of something you could look at analytically.
Yeah.
And then there was qualitative questions, tell us what you'd like us to hear about your thoughts on this topic. Each of the primary questions that composed the total survey, like the sort of areas of interest, were given both the quantitative section and the qualitative section. So basically there were 30,000 license holders that were sent surveys. If you look at the entirety of the thing, there's 11,000 responses. The questions that were quantitative ranged from 6,000 to 7,500 responses to each question. So basically there's like 4,000 responses roughly where somebody responded but didn't respond to all of the quantitative questions. And then there were between about 680 and I think it was just right here, 1,800 responses on the qualitative questions. So 33,000 people that are surveyed, 11,000, roughly a third, respond in some way. That's actually a really good response rate. And the 6,000 to 7,000 on the quantitative questions is, okay, so you've got a fairly significant response rate. And then on the qualitative, it drops quite considerably, and it sort of bounces around based on which question it is.
Maybe people didn't have a strong opinion.
Right. So it sort of makes sense that there's a smaller number of responses. It is kind of interesting to see that, like, the people who felt passionately enough about a given topic to respond, it was like minimum of 680 people responded. Like, there were some questions that only got 680 alternate or expanded responses.
I'm guessing we were in that 680.
Yeah. So, on pretty much every question, we contributed one of those things.
So just recapping, this is the third stage of the consultation, this survey.
Stage 1 was telephone interviews with, representatives of the stakeholders and stuff. So it was sort of individuals responding on behalf of that organization. We thought there'd be more marinas and things
like
businesses involved, but it was actually primarily, there it is, the Appendix D, a list of stakeholders. So stakeholder organizations, there were national groups like the Association of Waterways Cruising Clubs, British Marine, Inland Waterways, etc., skipping quite a few here. Then there were local groups to more specific areas, Birmingham Canal Navigations, Kennet Navan Trust, the Yorkshire Ex-Commercial Barge Club. There is the Commercial Operators Group, but what I'm not seeing is what I felt I would see, which is a fairly large list of hire boat companies and the various boating manufacturers and things.
So that was the first stage of the consultation.
Stage 2 was workshops with boaters to refine and improve scenarios with outputs used to inform the development of clear options for the future. So stage 2 was meant to focus it so that they knew what to ask in stage 3. And the point that they're making in here is that they presented kind of a larger amount of information than was presented in the third stage. It was carried out from May to June, comprised 9 workshops, and 81 people invited showed up to those workshops. So there were an average of 9 people per workshop.
Yeah, which is a really
small.
Yeah, like if you consider there's 33,000 license holders, to only take 81 take part in those workshops, it's really not it's not necessarily going to be representative.
I think it was impactful and like a beneficial thing to do, but it probably could have been organized better.
Yeah.
So then it ended up going to stage 3, and stage 3 was where they sent out surveys to every registered boat owner.
So another thing I found really interesting was the demographic of people that actually responded. I guess it's not really surprising when you think about it, but I do still find it interesting.
Their Appendix B, where they sort of go over all the quantitative questions and they start to sort of show what the demographics
But what about
of the response rates were. It's a little bit interesting because they don't really show us much about what the demographics of the customer base is.
Mm-hmm.
Gender, there were 6,559 respondents to the question of gender. So 78% male, 19% female, 3% other. I see quite a few single female boaters. I don't see as many single female
That's what
boaters
I
as
was
I
gonna say.
see
Male.
single male boaters.
Yeah.
Are a little bit more common than
Yeah.
but I wouldn't say that,
So it's
looking around the canals.
It's probably that out of the respondents of the couples, it was the man that responded.
Yeah.
Because that's what it was on this boat.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting because you get age. Age is very heavily weighted to 55 plus. 70% of the respondents were over 55.
So already we know that most of the respondents were male and over 55.
Yeah. Which is perfectly fine, and yet it's really interesting to think about whether or not that's representative of the people that are utilizing the boats.
Yeah, license holders.
Interestingly, like there is repeated things throughout the document where they're talking about trying to encourage younger people onto boats, and only 4% of the people who responded were under 34.
It's like nothing.
Yeah. So I guess if 35 to 54 counts as younger people, then we got 21% response rate.
Yeah,
so
it does, because we're in that bracket,
Yeah,
and
we're
we're
in that
definitely young.
Ethnicity was 90% white British. Our survey actually fell into the 3% white other because I'm not British. And I was the one filling the thing out. I mean, this is interesting from a healthcare perspective. 76% of the people who responded, who were primarily old white males, do not have a disability. So their health is in fairly good state. Their work status is primarily, about half retired, 30% full-time, and then dropping off for other types and stuff. Not working is actually very small, which does make sense. I mean, pretty much everybody, except for ourselves, that we've seen has been currently engaging in some other form of work or retired.
Okay, so this next one is one that I found really quite interesting. So this is the type of license that you hold. So the biggest one is a leisure boater with a home mooring.
62% of respondents.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then the next one
is a liveaboard motor with a home mooring. So that's somebody who either lives in a marina or lives in a permanent mooring.
So if you add the 62 and the 12 together, you've got 74% that actually have a home mooring. And then continuous cruisers.
There's a 6% leisure boater with no home mooring. So a leisure boater who does not live aboard but is a continuous cruiser.
So they come back to their boat every weekend or every other weekend
to move it. And 10% live aboard without a home mooring. So basically 16% was continuous cruisers.
So like immediately looking at that and thinking about the types of questions that were being asked, the responses are going to be from people who are male, over 55, retired, white, with a home mooring, and are leisure cruisers.
Right. So like these are people with a sufficient amount of money available to them to they own a boat, which they pay for a mooring for, and the license, while not using the boat very often.
Yeah.
So these are people with disposable income.
The majority of people are being asked about how to deal with the
minority problem. Yeah. And they have, as we'll see later, they have a bit of a tendency to
be self-serving.
Yes, yeah.
Which is understandable. And the next one that I've actually found quite interesting because of the topics that were asked is the type of boat. So 79% of respondents had a narrowboat, 11% had a cruiser, and only 6% had a wide beam. And considering like one of the main topics that we talked about before was should wide beams pay more because they take up more area. Because only 6% of the respondents were wide beams, were this 80% of narrowboats going to be like, of course you should pay by area because I'm narrow. And so in conclusion, of this demographic. You're basically a white male, over 55, you're retired, you're white, you pay by direct debit, and you have a narrowboat.
Yeah.
Now we should probably talk about the main themes of the changes that are actually going to be made.
One of the questions they asked was, over what time period should we make the changes? And they'd already been saying it would be a multi-year process. There was sort of a question as to how many multi-year. The decision was to go, no charge changes start until 2019, and all of the changes will have been phased in by 2023. So there's a 4-year transition period. Some of the changes will happen faster than that because they're small. For instance, the 1-day temporary licenses are just going to be eliminated in 2019. The main one and the impactful one is the wide beam brackets. So they're going to switch to a system where there will be 3 brackets for width. So right now there's sort of tiers for length. Your boat falls into one of those tiers and you pay that fee. And now there will be a separate tier for width. So if you are over 7 feet 1 inch, I think it is, then it will, by 2023, it will go to a 10% surcharge. And if you're over, I think it's 12 feet in width or 10 feet in width, you'll go to a 20% surcharge. So the wider you get, there will be two bandwidths where you will increment up in cost. There was general support for increased charges. Now it gets a little bit complicated because they've got the quantitative and the qualitative. Mm-hmm. So the most favored option for license fees to be calculated by actual area, so length times width. That was 58% of the quantitative respondents.
So that's, probably narrowboaters saying, well, yeah, increase charge by area.
The most logical one, and one of the alternatives people did bring up in the qualitative questions, is displacement. Mm-hmm. Displacement is hard because in order to measure displacement, you'd have to actually take the boat and put it into a lock and watch, and hey, yep, this is how much you displace, and now we'll charge by that. That's very, very hard to police. The narrowboaters are going to be more inclined to say charge by area. It is also the logical alternative. Almost every argument I've heard for not charging by area, including the one made by the C&Rt, is basically just not logical. The arguments come down to, they can't access as much as the waterways, but they made that choice.
That's like saying a 50-foot narrowboat.
Oh, yeah, that's the counterpoint, right? Like a 30-foot boat can access the entire canal system.
So a 30-foot boat should pay more than a 70-foot.
The idea that you should get a discount based on the fact that you can't access as much gets you into the position of I live in London, I'm not going to the Pennines, so shouldn't you give me a discount for not being able to access that portion of the canal system? Mm-hmm. The logic comes in with everyone is buying their share of access to the entirety of the system. You choose via your own, literally your own choices of where you want to go. You also choose via your choice of hardware how far you're going to be able to go. The logical answer is to charge by area. But it's also, you're right, there is also this inherent bias of the thing where the respondents are all narrowboaters.
Yeah. So general support for charging by area, thereby increasing the fee for the wide beam. People have referenced the fact that's what the Environment Agency do. Some people said it was seen as an unfair tax on wide beams.
A lot of people brought up the idea of wide beams having fewer accessible waterways. Mm-hmm. 84 people on the qualitative side brought up the idea that the wide beam doesn't restrict double moorings and that simultaneous lock use is just an erroneous thing because boats don't use them simultaneously. Mm-hmm. And my thing is we've been on a number of canals where we did routinely double through the locks. Whenever there was somebody to go through, we preferred to go through as a pair.
I'd say at least 50% of the time.
Right. We couldn't do that with a wide beam. Mm-hmm. Other than the Thames, you can't double moor 2 wide beams together. So I don't think it's entirely erroneous, but it is something that people brought up. There were people who said that length is as much of a factor in mooring issues as width. That's true, but it doesn't take into account the mooring is only a small portion of the problem.
Yeah, and it's only really a problem at certain times of year in certain areas.
Yeah, the longer boat does take up more area as it travels down the canal. So if you charge by area, you penalize both excessive length and excessive width, right? That's why area is more logical. If somebody goes and gets a 120-foot long narrowboat,
they're not going anywhere.
They're not going anywhere, but they're also being hit for having that extra size that is obstructing not just mooring space, but also navigational space.
So some other suggestions were that the license should be based on usage of the waterways. and its facilities, calculated by miles travelled.
And lots traversed. There was a fair amount of support for that idea. See, that one's weird to me because again, you've got like a very large percentage of the people responding are leisure boaters who have home moorings.
And
so all of these people don't go very far. So it just benefits them.
A lot of people suggested just leave it as it was. A number of people said flat fee for all boats.
Then they went to license fee to remain length-based, but with a wide beam uplift of up to 100%. So that's a percentage-based...
Which is what they've done.
Increase. Yeah, they've done that. They've chosen an arbitrary percentage of 20%. Only 54 people brought that idea up out of 881 people who gave a quantitative response. So those 54 people, you seem to have done, fairly well in getting heard. There were people suggesting that they should charge a liveaboard fee or supplement. I'm guessing most of those people weren't liveaboards. The reintroduction of a system of tolls for locks and tunnels.
Which is interesting, but then how on earth do you administrate that when you can't successfully track where boats are moored?
Yeah, and it adds other problems too, because now you've got a policing problem of like, okay, well, unless you've put a water point on both sides of a lock, now somebody has to traverse the lock to get to the water point. It's again an unrealistic policing problem. So then I like this one. License fee based on the value of the boat and or engine size. So this was a small number of respondents, and I think this small number of respondents were primarily the ones who don't have a lot of money. There weren't really any other major changes. The primary changes are the increase in fees for wide beams. There is going to be a retention of all of the discounts except for the electric discount, which is going to be, by 2019, they're going to do an additional, probably very costly review to find out whether or not there should be other environmental-based discounts. They're getting rid of the single-day temporary licenses. They're going to price the other temporary licenses based on the fact that they're more costly to administer than the year-long licenses. So basically, those temporary licenses may go up a little bit. They're going to decrease the prompt payment discount. I think it's currently 10%. Mm-hmm. If there'd been like a very strong sense that the prompt payment discount should be left alone, I think it probably would have maybe been left alone. But they'd made the fairly good case before that basically the prompt payment discount at this point is just costing them money. They put the prompt payment discount in to encourage more people to get off of very costly to administer forms of payment like checks and cash. Looking at this, so like 10% of the population was using non-automatic and non-electronic forms of payment. That means they've accomplished their goal. They've moved from a heavily check and cash based system to a dominantly electronic system. So there's no real justification for continuing this discount at all. What they're doing is they're halving the discount, so it's dropping to 5%. And then by 2014, they're going to switch it from being a prompt payment only discount to you'll get a 2.5% discount if you pay promptly, like an upfront payment, and you'll get a 2.5% discount if you pay electronically. So you can get a grand total of 5% discount. At the moment, by providing a 10% discount for upfront payment, they're incentivizing people to put a fairly large chunk of cash into the Canal and River Trust's hands at the beginning of each year. By removing it down to 10%, I think you'll see more people saying, you know what, time value of money being what it is, I'll sacrifice 2.5% and not prepay. I'll pay electronically, but I'll pay electronically over the course of a year because now I have less risk to inflation and monetary change.
So another thing I found quite interesting was the suggestions for changing the licenses for continuous cruises, which hasn't actually happened.
Even though this seemed to be like kind of the most important question in the thing, and a large number of people responded to it.
So the question was, how fair do you think it would be to take mooring status into consideration as part of the licensing process? And 6,608 people responded to this, and 61% of that number said it was fair to take in mooring status. Mm-hmm. So, but then if you think about the fact that, I've forgotten the number, but the majority of people answering the survey, they do have a home mooring, then of course they want that taken into consideration for, that just kind of makes logical sense for them, but not necessarily for the minority, the 16% who are continuous cruisers.
There isn't really strong agreement. There 61% of the population said, yeah, we could take mooring status into account, that's fair. But then you look at this other report, and it's like 50% said there should be the same as the current arrangement, right? So what do you end up with when 61% it's fair to take mooring status into account, but half the people said it's also fair for us to continue doing what we're doing right now?
So some people have contradicted themselves. And I found some of the comments interesting.
This one did get quite a few qualitative comments. A lot of people were concerned about there needing to be more enforcement.
And then there was the distinction of continuous cruisers, who I guess they see as people who are exploring the whole network, I guess, or continuous moorers who are
CC licensed, but not actually moving, I guess.
Well, moving backwards and forwards within the same area.
Bridge hopping idea.
Yeah.
There was a fair number of people who expressed support for continuous cruising.
And the benefits that brings to the waterways.
There were people who said that the proposed changes to licensing, even if they wanted it, was illegal. There were people making the argument that cruisers may actually travel less. I don't quite understand that, but...
No, I guess they mean the bridge hoppers.
Maybe, yeah. There were people who were saying that the continuous cruiser license fee should be abolished or limited in number, no new licenses issued. This was a very small minority of people, but there seems to be a small minority of people who really don't like continuous cruisers. There is this interesting idea: continuous cruisers use more of the waterways and facilities while paying less, while those with home moorings use less and pay more.
The thing is, when you've got home mooring, and especially if you're in a marina, what you're actually paying for is the facilities in that marina. You might have a secure parking, you might have a security gates like protecting your boat, and you might have a bar and a cafe and a laundrette and a hot shower and a toilet facility and an L-stand that you can use day in, day out. So while you're paying more, well, you're actually paying for these facilities.
If you choose to take an expensive home mooring versus choosing to take a cheap home mooring, does the person who has the expensive home mooring have right to complain about the actions of the people with the cheap home mooring?
No, because what they're paying for is the facilities. What you're paying for is, as someone who is a leisure boater with a home mooring, is the fact that you don't have to go to your boat every 2 weeks and move it. That's what you're paying for.
Right. The one thing that keeps coming back, if I am somebody who has a mooring in a marina and I never leave the marina, then should I have to pay for the, for the sort of usage portion of the license? And okay, that actually makes sense to me. Buy a marina, and wall it off from the canals so you don't have any water coming from outside, and I think you'll be fine. I do understand the sort of feeling of paying more.
But you're paying for something different.
You're paying for something different, and you're choosing not to access all the resources. Like if you were in a position to pay for that home mooring, and then you chose, for whatever reason, to pay for the home mooring, and then spent 364 days traveling around the canals, because what you want to do is go see the canals, then wouldn't you see that as a silly choice? Like, wouldn't you see that as an expense that you were entering into rather foolishly? Like, what would be the...
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, actually.
It's an optional expense. It's an option that should still exist. You're somebody who really is trying to see this beautiful industrial heritage and this fascinating community and world, and that entails getting out there and moving around. Then why would I continue to pay for a mooring?
So, what do you think of the process overall in terms of how the Canal and River Trust have done it?
I think the process overall it could have been better communicated.
Yeah, but then the first part we weren't
around.
We weren't license holders, so we can't really comment on that.
No, but also I did read the reports that they put online throughout that process. And the first part of that process, where they were talking to the stakeholders, was relatively opaque. It left a lot of people, including us, with sort of a sense of, well, who are these stakeholders? If it was on the website, it was in a form that wasn't all that easy to consume. Then they go to the consultations with the various license holders, and I thought that was a good idea. But then when I heard afterwards that it was a fairly small turnout, that sort of led to just more questions about how well this process was being handled. Then the third part of the consultation comes out, and we see a bunch of questions which do have some sort of inbuilt biases, but they're not terribly large, but they're just there. Well, then when the final report comes out, I guess I got the feeling of like, well, actually, they seem to have been pretty reasonable. Like, they've started down this pathway that looked like it was primarily about trying to restrain the continuous cruising idea.
I don't know if that's what it looked like, but that's what people definitely felt.
Saw as a perception. That perception I think has been invalidated by the fact that their final decision was to do nothing about the continuous cruising.
Especially when the majority of people who commented on that question did suggest that continuous cruisers should pay more.
Yeah.
So that if you were to follow the results to the letter and implement what people asked for, then you would have...
Yeah, from a pure democracy point of view, people without a home mooring would be paying more right now. There is a consistent sense that, yes, you can take mooring into account, and then there's also numbers which support the idea that this continuous mooring thing is a problem. So they seem to still be looking at it and going, yes, there is an issue, but we're not going to make a kind of, community devastating decision on it. Likewise with the wide beams. I fully support the idea of going by area. I think that area would make more sense. Area would charge everybody who went over a certain size in length and width more. But I think that would be proportional. And to me, proportional seems the most fair. They've received a mandate from people saying proportional is the most fair, and they've gone and said, well, actually, they're going to go with this triple band system.
But also, thinking about it, if you were a double width wide beam, then you'd be looking at, even if it was over 5 years, of your license fee doubling if it was, going to go by area. So,
yeah, and your license fee is going to go up 20%.
And so 20% is a lot. Doubling is, the difference between being able to afford it and not afford it. So you kind of, like you were saying last night, you kind of get the impression that the C&Rt is looking out for the smaller groups like the wide beam owners and the continuous cruisers. They're not just listening to the
voice of the crowd.
Yeah.
That puts some hope into me for some of the future things. I also feel like there are portions of this whole process, which was obviously not an inexpensive process, but there are portions which seem somewhat ill-advised. The discounts. I understand trying to establish sort of a mandate for changing discount structures and stuff, but if you go down and you look at the actual, which in one of the documents that they posted, which is kind of the summary of the entire process, you can zoom down and eventually find like the actual questionnaire that was sent out to everybody. The questionnaire was 15 pages long, and roughly half of that was taken up about questions regarding discounts. And ultimately they decided to keep all of the discounts because there was strong support for all of them. I think, well, no kidding. They're there for a reason. Most of them establish like some obvious good. So
it's a disproportionate amount of the survey spent asking questions about discounts.
Things that have seemingly obvious answers and don't affect a great deal of boats and can't affect the bottom line to any large
they
degree.
can't affect the income.
Like there's a whole question about whether or not multiple discounts should be allowed.
Well, how many people have?
It's like, yeah.
How many people have two boats?
How many people have two discounts?
So getting rid of these discounts is not going to raise revenue significantly enough to warrant spending such a large proportion of the survey.
Yeah,
about them.
Yeah, just because it takes up a large portion of the survey, the bulk of the survey reduces your likelihood of getting responses, right? When it comes to the majority of these, it's kind of a no-brainer that they're going to have strong support. And even if they don't have strong support, they don't have a significant enough impact to worry about. Yeah, like to ask 30,000 people whether or not they support giving a discount to boats that service the disabled is like...
That's crazy.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean...
It's a waste of a question.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it kicks off to a second thing, because there's the question about the electric boats, which again, I've seen 2. I know of 4. So the number of boats which are taking advantage of this electric drive one to even bother asking the question of whether or not this discount makes sense. People responded. Lots of people responded. A point of controversy was built up over a non-issue to produce now an outcome in which they are pledging in here to, by 2019, engage in a swift consultation about this question of electrical boat discounts versus green boat discounts and stuff. All you're going to do, really, maybe, is get an additional discount introduced. Maybe reduce the discount for the few people who own electric boats. So I just felt like that was a, rather unfortunate sort of usage of resources. Like I say, getting back 1/3 of the responses is really quite remarkable. This licensing review is the first one that's happened in 20 years. This is a system that 20 years ago there couldn't have been anywhere near as many boats on the water and everything, right? This is a system that needs attention, and to divide that attention up onto questions that just seem sort of silly in proportion to their impact just waters down the whole thing. So I don't think that that's necessarily a negative, but I just think it's something to like...
Looking at an observation. So I hope you found that video interesting. As I said at the beginning, it was just our kind of observations and our thoughts on the process and on the results. And as Michael said, we'll link the documents below so you can go and have a read of them yourself. We'd love to hear your opinions in the comments. Although, having said that, we're a bit behind on replying to comments at the moment, so...
There were too many of them.
But we really like getting them. So thanks for watching if you've made it to the end of this hour and a half.
Yes, which won't be an hour and a half by the time you're done. So I do find this part quite interesting.
We need to introduce this first.
Yes. Okay, sorry, I didn't even know we were taping it. My head's cut off. Hello. Welcome to George TV. I am George.
I don't like being the outside person.
She doesn't like being the outside person. Okay, we can switch seats.
No, because then George has to get out.
Yes.
Okay.
You ready?
I'm ready.
We can wait if you want to.
Till when?
Till we switch seats.
No, but then we have to get George out.
Well, yes.
Are you more comfortable on this side?
You can't complain about something if you're not willing to change it.
Would you prefer to be on this side?
No, it doesn't matter.
So, I always say so.
So, and the rest of the people on that sort of list. But it was all conducted by television. Stage 2 television. It was all...
Yeah, so if you had the 62 and the 12, you've got 74 people who have got a permanent mooring.
74% who have a permanent mooring, yeah.
Is that, what did I say?
You said 74 people. You know, when you combine them up, the direct debit, credit and debit over the telephone versus credit and debit postal or credit and debit online, you're getting to, you know, what, we got 55,
90%.
That's 20, 75, 89%.
90%.
55 plus 19 and 1, that's 20, so
Well,
that's 75 plus 14, that's 89.
It doesn't add up to 100% though.
No, it doesn't add up to 100%.
1% don't pay?
Possibly? Yeah, I don't really know.
1 plus 9 plus 19 plus 14 plus 1 plus 55.
This adds up to 99.
99%.
Right?
So that's really funny.
Yeah.
1% don't
1% have just disappeared off the face of the thing. But anyway, that's... It's like I can do the math. But in the same sense that I wouldn't continue to pay for a private parking spot in London if I was driving around Yorkshire for a year. Right? I don't know why I'd be driving around Yorkshire for a year. But